The mercenaries descended onto the war-torn planet with a sense of invincibility. A notorious group of intergalactic warriors, they had completed countless missions, each more dangerous than the last, without so much as a scratch. Today was no different. The atmosphere was thick with the remnants of battle smoke swirling in the air, the scent of ozone and burned earth seeping into their nostrils. The mercenaries, hardened and ruthless, were here for one reason: profit. The target was simple: eliminate a rebel faction that had been causing turmoil for the planet's ruling government. A few skirmishes, a few dozen bodies, and they would collect their pay and leave. That was the plan, anyway, but they weren't prepared for what awaited them. Hidden in the shadows of the ruined cityscape. These weren't the run-of-the-mill soldiers the mercenaries had fought before. These were the Deathworlders. Their reputation for survival in impossible conditions was whispered across the galaxy, a myth some laughed off, others feared. They came from a planet where every living thing had evolved to survive in the harshest of environments: hostile weather, lethal predators, and a world that constantly sought to end their existence. The first shot rang out. An alien mercenary dropped, his body crumpling to the ground like a rag doll, his armor useless against the precision of the attack. Another mercenary's laser cannon fired wildly, but it was cut short by a sudden, swift strike from the shadows. Within minutes, the field was chaos. Blasts of energy filled the air, smoke rising from destroyed vehicles, and a growing unease began to settle in the mercenaries' minds. Something wasn't right. They had faced enemies before, but these warriors, they didn't fight to win. They fought to survive. And that made them a far more terrifying force. To understand the terror the mercenaries faced, one must first understand the nature of the Deathworlders. Their homeworld was not like any other. It was a planet where death was not only common, but inevitable, where every aspect of life fought to survive against an environment that sought to destroy it. The Deathworlders had evolved not by thriving in peaceful habitats, but by surviving constant, brutal challenges. Their planet was a jungle of violent storms, earthquakes, and dangerous predators that would tear apart any unprepared species. Their survival depended on it. From birth, Deathworlders were conditioned to adapt to this unrelenting world. They learned to endure extreme temperatures, to fight against predators far stronger than themselves, and to move silently through the wilds where every step could mean death. Their physiology was honed by this environment: muscle mass dense enough to survive a fall from great heights, reflexes fast enough to dodge attacks from beasts twice their size, and a mind sharpened by the necessity of making life-or-death decisions in mere seconds. The most fearsome of all were the Deathworlder Special Forces, the elite of the elite. Trained to fight as a unit, their tactics were unconventional, blending strategies from the most brutal animals and the deadliest of natural disasters. They didn't rely on advanced technology or high-powered weaponry. They used the environment, the terrain, and their own bodies as deadly weapons. They were survival incarnate, and they feared nothing. And now they had the mercenaries in their sights. ASE, the alien mercenaries, advanced. They moved like well-oiled machines, their tactics synchronized, their weapons aimed and ready. They had superior technology, superior training, and superior numbers. They were confident, perhaps too confident. The mercenaries began their assault on the rebel stronghold, confident that their advanced weapons and tactics would overwhelm anything the rebels could muster. However, as they pushed deeper into the crumbling city, something felt off. It was too quiet. Then it happened. A shot rang out from an impossible angle, a high-pitched whine that cut through the air just before the mercenary in the lead dropped, his skull punctured by a single, silent bullet. No one had seen where it came from. Panic rippled through the mercenaries' ranks. The next shots came faster, sharper, and from directions they hadn't anticipated. The Deathworlders moved like ghosts, appearing and disappearing in the smoke and rubble, their movements swift and unnervingly precise. The mercenaries fired back, but it was no use. Every time they thought they had a shot, the Deathworlders were gone, slipping into the shadows. One mercenary, a seasoned veteran named Zarnak, moved quickly to regain control of the situation. He barked orders to his squad, telling them to regroup and secure a defensible position. But as he turned to survey the battlefield, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure taller and stronger than any human, standing alone among the ruins. The Deathworlder was unarmed, and yet there was a fearlessness in its posture, as though it had no regard for the dangers around it. Zarnak's heart skipped a beat. He recognized that posture. It was the stance of a hunter, not a soldier. And they were the prey. As the figure moved, Zarnak realized the terrifying truth. The Deathworlders weren't just soldiers. They were predators. With that realization came fear, real fear. The kind that gnawed at the edges of a mercenary's bravado. The kind that made even the most hardened warrior question their chances of survival. The battle raged on, but the mercenaries were no longer fighting with confidence. They were fighting to stay alive. In the aftermath of the battle, the surviving mercenaries gathered in the ruins of a collapsed building, their bodies battered and their spirits broken. Zarnak, ever the strategist, sat apart from the others, his mind racing. His thoughts drifted back to the many stories he had heard about Deathworlders' whispers in the dark corners of spaceports, rumors from other mercenary groups, tales of warriors who seemed to defy all reason, all logic. He had always dismissed them as exaggerations, the kind of myths that grew around a particularly dangerous enemy. They fight like beasts, some had said. They don't feel pain. They don't fear death. It had all sounded like the kind of hyperbole that accompanied any truly fearsome force. Zarnak had heard it all before, but now, as he sat amidst the wreckage, those stories no longer seemed so far-fetched. The Deathworlders didn't fight like mercenaries, didn't fight for honor or money or even for victory. They fought to survive, and in that survival, they had become unstoppable. The very thought of it chilled him to the bone. The Deathworlders didn't need to win. They only needed to outlast their opponents. They didn't stop until the last one of their enemies was dead, and in their minds, there was no such thing as surrender. They would do anything to ensure their survival, no matter how brutal, no matter how savage. Zarnak felt his stomach twist at the realization. He could see it now, the fear in the eyes of his fellow mercenaries, the uncertainty in their movements. They were no longer focused on completing the mission or securing the payout. They were only thinking of one thing: survival. The Deathworlders had shown them a kind of ruthless efficiency that no amount of training or technology could overcome. It was the kind of fear that gnawed at the soul, a fear of the unknown, a fear that they were out of their depth in a way they had never encountered before. Zarnak clenched his fists. They had underestimated the Deathworlders, but it was too late to turn back now. They had to keep moving forward, or else they would be hunted down, one by one. Zarnak had always prided himself on his composure. He had fought in countless battles, faced down rival mercenary squads, and survived conflicts that would have broken lesser warriors. He was a seasoned veteran, a mercenary who had earned his reputation through years of bloodshed and ruthlessness. But as he watched his team struggle, as he saw the terror in their eyes and the confusion in their tactics, something inside him started to crack. The Deathworlders weren't just another enemy, they were something else entirely. Every time Zarnak thought he had a clear advantage, the Deathworlders turned the tables. They didn't fight like soldiers, they fought like animals, with a brutal, unrelenting instinct that Zarnak couldn't understand, couldn't predict. They adapted too quickly, countering every strategy, every move, with terrifying precision. The Deathworlders seemed to be everywhere, always one step ahead, always in the shadows, always hunting. Zarnak had never known fear like this before. There were moments in battle when even the most hardened mercenary could feel the weight of their mortality pressing down on them. But this was different. This was a kind of fear that eroded your will to fight, that made you question the very reason you were still alive. He could see the cracks forming in his own resolve. It wasn't the physical pain that got to him, it was the psychological toll. The constant, grinding pressure of knowing that no matter what he did, no matter how many of the Deathworlders he killed, there were always more. The weight of that knowledge pushed him to his breaking point. Zarnak's mind raced as he struggled to regain his focus. The mission, the money, it all seemed meaningless now. In the face of such an unrelenting force, it no longer mattered. He could already see the bodies of his comrades, scattered across the battlefield, their lives snuffed out by enemies who had no regard for anything but survival. For the first time in his career, Zarnak questioned the cost of the mission. Was it worth it? Was any amount of credits worth facing an enemy that fought for survival in ways no mercenary could ever truly comprehend? The fear took root deeper in his mind. The next time he faced a Deathworlder, he wasn't sure he could hold his ground. The mercenaries regrouped, their once strong formation now a scattered mess of nervous, jittery soldiers. The Deathworlders had given them no chance to recover. The brief respite was over. As the mercenaries began to rearm and strategize, Zarnak couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. They were running out of time. They had to finish the job, but every minute that passed seemed to bring them closer to their inevitable end. Then the Deathworlders struck again. This time, it wasn't just a few well-placed shots or ambushes from the shadows. The Deathworlders launched a full assault, moving with terrifying speed and coordination. They came at the mercenaries from every angle, attacking with brutal, precise strikes that made even their advanced weaponry seem useless. Zarnak had ordered his team to set up defensive positions, but the Deathworlders were already inside their perimeter before they could react. Their guerrilla tactics had rendered cloaking devices and traps useless. Every weapon the mercenaries deployed seemed to be countered before it could even be fired. The Deathworlders didn't need the same tech, the same tools. They were living weapons, and they knew exactly how to use the environment to their advantage. Zarnak's squad, once so sure of their superiority, was now in full retreat. It was no longer about completing the mission. It was about escaping with their lives. One by one, mercenaries fell, their bodies shredded by the relentless onslaught. The mercenaries tried everything they could think of to stop the Deathworlders, setting traps, deploying mines, using long-range sniping positions, but nothing worked. The Deathworlders adapted instantly, shifting their tactics and finding new ways to exploit every mistake. The battle was no longer just a clash of armies. It was a brutal game of cat and mouse, and the mercenaries were the prey. Zarnak could feel the weight of their hopelessness pressing down on him. There was no escape, no negotiation, no surrender that would save them. The Deathworlders didn't stop. They didn't hesitate. They didn't fear. And as Zarnak's team fell one by one, he realized the horrible truth. The Deathworlders weren't just another enemy. They were an unstoppable force, a predator that couldn't be stopped by anything less than complete annihilation. The mercenaries were running out of options, running out of time, and the Deathworlders? They were just getting started. As the alien mercenaries regrouped, a sinking realization began to settle over them. Their confidence had been shattered like glass, and no matter how hard they tried to reassemble their fractured forces, the stark truth remained. They had grossly underestimated their enemies. They had come expecting a challenge, perhaps even a worthy adversary, but nothing had prepared them for the raw, unrelenting force of the Deathworlders. The mercenaries' once vaunted advanced weaponry state-of-the-art rifles capable of piercing armored hulls, cloaking devices that rendered them invisible, explosive traps designed to decimate groups of enemies were rendered utterly useless. Time and time again, the Deathworlders countered their every move with the frightening ease of predators who had been honed by the cruelest environment in the galaxy. The traps were disarmed with a fluidity that seemed almost too perfect. Cloaking devices were ineffective, the Deathworlders simply sensing their presence as though they could smell the fear radiating from them. In desperation, the mercenaries tried to change their tactics. They split into smaller, more mobile groups, hoping to overwhelm their enemies by sheer numbers and unpredictable movement. But the Deathworlders anticipated every move. They moved in silence, blending with the environment in ways that made their attacks feel like they were coming from every direction at once. It was as though the environment itself was a weapon in their hands. Every shadow, every piece of rubble, every gust of wind was used to their advantage. No matter how the mercenaries adapted, the Deathworlders seemed to be a step ahead. Each failed attempt to catch the enemy off guard, each miscalculation, added another layer to the mounting dread that gripped the mercenaries' hearts. Their fear was no longer just a feeling, it was an ever-present force that twisted their instincts and turned their calculated military strategies into reckless, panicked actions. The tide of battle had shifted so dramatically that even the most experienced of the mercenaries began to doubt if they would make it out alive. The once pristine ranks of the mercenaries were now in full retreat, their casualties mounting with every passing moment. It wasn't just the physical losses, they had begun to lose something much more important, their resolve. They were a seasoned group, but in the face of the Deathworlders, they were mere children playing with fire. The mission, once so simple in their minds, was now a death sentence. Yet, they kept pushing forward, desperate for any advantage, any glimmer of hope that would allow them to escape this nightmare alive. Their desperation reached its peak when they attempted to use every trick they had. They activated their cloaking devices, praying to slip away unnoticed. But the Deathworlders were there, waiting. They had seen this tactic before. The mercenaries were met not with confusion or uncertainty, but with swift and efficient attacks that tore through the already battered ranks. One of the mercenaries, a seasoned commander named Gorak, decided it was time for a last-ditch effort. He led his squad into an abandoned building, hoping to make their final stand. They fortified the position with explosives, barricades, and automated turrets, creating a stronghold in the heart of the city ruins. If they couldn't win, at least they could make the Deathworlders pay for every inch of ground they gained. But the Deathworlders didn't care about their traps. They weren't looking for an easy victory. They were hunting. And Gorak's squad quickly realized that they were not facing an enemy that could be reasoned with, outsmarted, or even defeated through conventional warfare. When the Deathworlders finally closed in, it wasn't just a battle. It was the culmination of everything the mercenaries had feared. The Deathworlders didn't speak, didn't call for reinforcements, didn't wait for anything. They simply moved with deadly precision, sweeping in from all angles, turning Gorik's stronghold into a tomb. There was no grand battle cry, no final warning. It was just the inescapable certainty that they were about to die. In the face of such relentless assault, the mercenaries could no longer pretend they were fighting for glory or money. This wasn't about contracts or the thrill of battle. This was a fight for survival. They weren't soldiers facing off against another military force. They were prey. And the Deathworlders were the apex predators. The decision was made for them. Some tried to run, but there was no escape. Others fought, but they were outmatched, overwhelmed by the sheer might of the Deathworlders. The few who remained were finally cornered, their weapons useless against the unstoppable force that pressed in from all sides. And then, the mercenaries were forced to make a choice, surrender or die. For the first time in their lives, they were faced with an enemy that didn't fear death, an enemy that embraced it. The Deathworlders weren't just surviving on their hostile homeworld, they were thriving in it, and it had made them something far beyond ordinary soldiers. Their indifference to their own mortality was their greatest weapon. To the mercenaries, it was both a terrifying realization and a grim understanding that their own survival instincts would be the very thing that led them to their doom. One of the mercenaries, a young warrior named Varnak, dropped to his knees, tears welling in his eyes as the realization sank in. He tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but the Deathworlders showed no interest in his pleas. They didn't need to. Death was something they had already accepted long ago. To them, it was not a finality. It was simply another step in their cycle of life. They moved in, not with hatred or malice, but with the cold precision of creatures who had been born into the understanding that survival came first, and anything that threatened that survival must be eradicated. The battle ended quickly after that, the mercenaries either dead or broken beyond recognition. Only a few survived, and those survivors were left with the bitter realization that they had been outmatched by a force they could never truly comprehend. The Deathworlders didn't fear death. They didn't even fear the fear that had crippled the mercenaries. The Deathworlders were the living embodiment of survival, and they had no place for those who were not as relentless as they were. The surviving mercenaries, once proud and arrogant, now had only one lesson to share. When facing the Deathworlders, fear of death was not a weakness. It was a death sentence. They had learned, too late, that survival was never guaranteed. The Deathworlders didn't fight for anything other than the chance to continue living, and nothing, not advanced technology, not sheer numbers, not tactics or traps, could change that fundamental truth. Word of the encounter spread across the galaxy, becoming a story whispered in the halls of mercenary guilds and among the most seasoned warriors. The reputation of the Deathworlders grew, and they were no longer seen as a myth or an anomaly. They were a force of nature, and any mercenary foolish enough to think they could defeat them now knew what had happened to those who tried. In the wake of the battle, contracts involving the Deathworlders became a point of caution. No one spoke of them in any but the most reverent tones, and anyone who did not acknowledge the immense danger they posed found themselves quickly out of a job. The fear of the Deathworlder Special Forces was now etched into the collective consciousness of the universe, and any future encounters with them would carry with them an unspoken acknowledgement. Survival was not guaranteed.